Hey guys, what's up? It's Savannah. Welcome back to my channel, and today we are back with another true crime video. I obviously did not put a lot of effort into my appearance today, as you can tell, and if I'm just being honest, I am so exhausted today. I have no idea why. I don't know if it's jet lag, I don't know if it's because I'm getting sick, but I'm just not feeling my best today, so that's why I put pretty minimal effort into my appearance, but I hope that's okay, because we are here not to talk about my appearance today. We are here to talk about a missing persons case. The case that we're going to be covering today is one that I had never heard of, and once I started doing research on it and started really looking into it, my mind was just blown the more research I did as to how crazy this whole situation is in the bigger picture. And I'm trying not to give too much away, and you guys will understand what I mean once I get into it. So the case we're talking about today is about one particular person. However, later down the line, I'm going to be kind of expanding it into the broader sense of things, and you guys will understand more, like I said, when I get into it. So I'm just going to do that right now. As you can tell by the title of today's video, today we are talking about the disappearance of 6-year-old Dennis Martin. Dennis was 6 years old when he disappeared on June 14th of 1969 in Tennessee. Dennis Martin was born on June 20th of 1962. Dennis lived with his father Bill Martin as well as his brother Douglas, who was 9 years old at the time. So it was the weekend of Father's Day in 1969, and Dennis, his brother Douglas, as well as his father and his grandfather Clyde Martin, the four of them decided to visit the Great Smoky Mountains National Park to celebrate Father's Day. All four of them went up together. So on the second day of them being at this national park, they decided to hike over to Spence Field, which is where they met another family, which coincidentally they had the same name, Martin, as well, and they also had two boys around the age of Douglas and Dennis. They were more around Douglas's age, but all four of the boys decided to play together in the field, and the three adults, Bill, Clyde, as well as the other two boys' father, Carter Martin, all watched as all four boys played in the field. I know this gets very confusing. Trust me, I got very confused in reading it, but it's important to note that Douglas, Dennis, Clyde, as well as Bill are not related to Carter Martin and his two boys. But they all kind of got together and started playing, and all four boys decided they wanted to play a prank on the adults, so they all kind of huddled together and decided that they were going to try and scare the adults by going off and hiding and then jumping out at them all at once. Obviously, the adults knew what was going on. They were watching their kids kind of huddle together and look back at the adults and like huddle back together and laugh and things like that, so they knew what was happening, but they kind of just let them do their own thing so they could pretend like they were scared and let the kids feel like they scared them and just have fun. So this was on June 14th between the hours of 3 o'clock and 4 o'clock p.m. Like I said, the younger boys were all huddling together trying to play pranks on their parents. So the four boys planned to hide in the woods and jump out and scare their parents. Dennis this particular day was wearing a bright red shirt, and the other three older boys thought that because Dennis was wearing this bright red shirt, it would be way too easy for the adults to spot them and ruin their prank. They told Dennis to go hide behind this bush by himself, and the other three boys were gonna go hide in a different area. But mind you, through this whole process, the adults were watching, the adults were seeing what was going on. Dennis's father even recalls watching Dennis walk behind this particular bush. So this all happened within a span of 5 to 10 minutes, and when it was time to jump out and to scare the adults, the three boys that hid together, Douglas and the two others, jumped out, but Dennis never did. At first, everyone kind of thought that Dennis just missed his cue and forgot to come out at the time that everyone did, but when Bill went behind the bush to see where Dennis had gone originally, Dennis was not there. So once the families both realized that Dennis was nowhere to be found, they immediately sprung into action and started looking for him. They started calling out his name, they started looking everywhere. Dennis's father as well as his grandfather both split up to go search the surrounding areas, because the initial thought is Dennis should not have gotten very far. If this was only like a couple minute time span, you wouldn't think he would go very far. It's not like he could run very far or very fast. He's 6 years old, he was 55 pounds, he was about 4 feet tall. Like, he didn't have the ability to travel very far at his age. So his father and his grandfather both split up to start looking at the surrounding areas, while the other boys as well as Carter Martin started just yelling for Dennis, looking around and just seeing where he could have possibly gone, because he literally just disappeared without a trace. So the park rangers in the national park were notified pretty much immediately, and they started their search right away. It was 3 park rangers initially, and the 3 of them had split up and went on different trails to try to search for Dennis. They initially started their search in the areas that Dennis would have been able to travel to, mainly by foot. So they also started looking at the areas that were nearby where they all were at Spence Field. So the family as well as the park rangers were searching all night until a thunderstorm came in, and this thunderstorm brought in 2.5 inches of rain. So any evidence or real clues were all threatened to be washed away at this point, because there was this massive thunderstorm that gave 2.5 inches of rain. Something to note about Dennis is hiking was not unusual for him. He was an outdoors type of kid. He loved playing outdoors. He loved playing with his brother outdoors. He loved being outside and playing hide and seek and doing this. this and that. And not only that, this was not the first time the Martin family had visited this national park. They had been there before. In fact, they had been there multiple times before. So this wasn't like Dennis's first time being there. Granted, it was a huge park. It was giant. Before a 6-year-old, Dennis was really used to hiking and used to being outdoors. Also, something to note is that the park rangers at the time had a zero search and rescue plan, meaning that if someone were to go missing, they had no protocol as to how to go about it, which most places do. So they were kind of just coming up with this plan on the spot and decided to all spread out and search where they could and where they thought Dennis would be, but their search ended in nothing. Let's talk about Spence Field for a second. So like I said, Dennis was used to hiking and used to being outdoors and was typically not just someone who would wander off for whatever reason. Spence Field was actually very hard to navigate and very easy to get lost in. Where they were had a lot of fog. It wasn't very easy to see that far out in the distance, as well as there was a lot of mountain terrain, a lot of thicket in the woods. The creeks that flowed through the national park, there were many of them. A lot of them were very loud, and a lot of people thought that they would have the ability to muffle a scream if Dennis were to be screaming or anything like that. A lot of people thought they wouldn't be able to hear it because of that. So June 15th, which was the second day of his disappearance, the search party grew up to be about 240 people, which is a lot of people. And there's two sides to this, because as great as it was to have that many people searching for Dennis, it also had a very big negative effect on the search, because there's 240 people who aren't trained professionals to go looking. They all just kind of scattered out and went looking, which if you think about it can contaminate unknowingly with a lot of evidence or any potential evidence, because these people weren't trained. And so by just wandering certain areas and looking for Dennis, they could have potentially caused more harm than good, which I actually never even realized. I never knew that until I was reading articles and doing more research on it, because I always kind of thought the more the merrier in the sense. But if you think about it, when people really don't know what they're doing, it can actually do more harm than good. And the growth of the search party didn't just stop there. In the days following his disappearance, many more people joined, and I'm talking hundreds. But at least now there were actually more trained professionals searching. So they had the FBI involved, they had the park rangers involved, they had 2 bloodhound dogs, they had locals in the area, that people who were volunteering just to help. They had the National Guards, they had helicopters, they even called in the Green Berets. If I'm saying this wrong, definitely kind of correct me in the comments below, because I want to get this right. From what I could tell, they're basically special forces, and they're trained to go into areas to search for people in harsh conditions and find them. Eventually, the search party grew up to be 1,400 people searching for Dennis through this national park and through Spence Field and through the area surrounding it. 1,400 people, 1,400 people. But Dennis was nowhere to be found, and there was not a trace of evidence to link him to wherever he could be. Now fast forward to June 17th, Dennis had now been missing for 3 days. About 2:30 in the afternoon that day, when everyone was doing their searches, there was a set of footprints found. Footprints were actually pretty interesting because they were 1 shoe on, 1 shoe off footprints. So it was a barefoot footprint and then a regular shoe footprint, so on and so forth. The shoe that made these imprints was an Oxford type shoe, which coincidentally enough, Dennis happened to be wearing that day. These prints went on for about 300 feet until they stopped at a creek, and this creek eventually led into a lake. And what's crazy about this is that because this footprint was found on the 3rd day that Dennis had been missing, and this area had technically already been searched. People had already looked through this area and found no footprints, and then on the 3rd day, these footprints show up. The footprints weren't even really looked into in detail like they should have been, because the authorities believed that because the area had already been searched, there was no need to search it again. So the one possible lead that they had at that point, they didn't even follow through with, because they thought they already searched that area and these shoe prints could have came up from a different person at a different time. But what's funny is that the search that went on, there were no kids involved in it. So no children were involved in the search. And the one thing they did do in this is they did end up measuring the footprint, and it was known to be like a child-sized footprint. So it wasn't an adult, this wasn't a grown person, this was a child, and there were no children involved in the search. And the park wasn't open to the public at this time because the search was going on. So the only thing they did was measure that footprint and see that it belonged to a child. And after that, the footprint was off the table, and they just continued on with their search, not regarding it at all. And one of the bigger theories in this is that because the footprints lead to a creek and then they just disappear, is that if these footprints did belong to Dennis, maybe he decided that he wanted to get across the creek, or thought that he could get across the creek, ended up falling in because the current was so strong, and ended up drowning, and his body was in the lake. But no one searched this lake either. This lake was called Fontana Lake. lake. I'm looking down so I pronounce it right, and I believe that's how you pronounce it, Fontana or Fontana Lake. And most of the creeks in this area led to this one lake, but no one searched the lake, so they just kind of ruled it out without searching it. So when doing research, I was able to find some of the notes that were taken at the first strategy meeting that was held on June 18th, so 4 days after Dennis had disappeared. I'm gonna look down here just so I can kind of tell you everything in order and how it all went. These notes were made by the chief ranger at the time, and these notes were basically just things that needed to change about this investigation and what was holding them back. According to him, he says that the roads were in a really bad condition, they were muddy. He also said that they needed more helicopters. The helicopters were running on jet fuel, and the helicopters would have to stop at certain points, obviously, to be able to be refueled, and in that process, they would lose searching time. While they were on the ground, they obviously weren't able to be up in the air searching for Dennis. And these notes also included the thought of getting North Carolina involved because this park was essentially on the state lines of Tennessee and North Carolina. And there was also a suggestion that the searchers should start mapping out where they were each day, so everyone would have been on the same page with what had already been searched as well as what hadn't been searched and where to look again and things like that, which kind of blows my mind that they weren't already doing that to begin with. They were kind of just having a free-for-all. As you can tell, this search was very unorganized. But you do have to keep in mind that this was 1969, so it wasn't as organized, and they didn't really have a search and rescue protocol, so they were just kind of having this huge unorganized investigation. So when it comes to any missing child, one of the first things that police typically do is look at the family, and as we've seen with a lot of previous cases, it is 100% reasonable that they do so, because typically when it involves a child, there's either a custody battle or there's abuse happening or something along those lines. The FBI decided to look into the Martin family, but they came out so clean. The FBI really wasn't able to find anything that would suggest that the Martin family had anything to do with this. Also, keep in mind, there was a whole other family there when this all happened. Carter Martin, as well as his two sons, were also there, and they weren't saying anything really different than the father and the grandfather of Dennis were saying themselves. The police really had no reason to believe that the Martin family was responsible for this. So now we get into the part of this case that really just twists things around and things get really weird. There's a lot of questions, it's a lot of confusion, it even involves a little bit of like paranormal stuff, and it is just a lot of craziness. So the only possible sighting of Dennis came from a man named Harold Keyes, and Harold Keyes was 45 years old at the time. He was from Tennessee, he was visiting the national park with his family, he was with his wife and son at the time of when this happened. Harold, as well as his son and his wife, were walking around the trail about 9 miles away from Spence Field at the time. Harold says the reason they were walking these trails in particular is because they were looking for wildlife. They were looking for a bear or any sort of wild animal that they could find just to kind of sightsee it, and they thought it would be really cool. According to Harold, while the three of them were walking, they ended up hearing this gut-wrenching scream. Harold said this scream was unlike anything he had ever heard before, and right after that happened, his son pointed out what he thought was a bear. He told his dad, "Look, there's a bear right there, like we found a bear." So then Harold ended up looking more closely at what his son was pointing out, and he said what his son thought was a bear was actually a man. Harold said he saw a dark-figured, really rough-looking man. According to Harold, while he was watching this man, the man had been trying to hide behind a bush and then proceeded to get up and walk with 2 legs with something over his shoulder. So Harold said that he wasn't really able to figure out what exactly this man had thrown over his shoulder, but something created this gut-wrenching scream that he had heard. He also said that this figure ended up walking into a white vehicle and ended up driving away. So now we're gonna kind of dive into the theory that gets talked about a lot in this case, and I couldn't just not mention it because it gets talked about all the time in this case. So a lot of people believe that because Harold pointed out that this was a dark-figured, roughed-up looking man, and his son pointed out that it was a bear, his son was convinced multiple times that it was a bear, even after his father said it wasn't. A lot of people came up with the theory that this was some sort of man-bear combination. A lot of people thought that this was Bigfoot. I know that there are a lot of differing opinions about Sasquatches and if they're real or if they're fake or what's the deal, but a lot of people truly believed that there was a Bigfoot living in this forest, which leads a lot of people to believe that a Bigfoot is what ultimately abducted Dennis and took him away. There really isn't a lot more evidence to back up this being a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch or whatever you want to call it. The only really evidence that there is Harold and his son both having differing opinions about what they saw. A lot of people believe that this figure, what Harold had seen, was some man hiding in the bushes or living in the bushes, someone who didn't want to be seen, who didn't want to be found, for whatever reason that may be. But the question with that is, okay, if they didn't want to be found, why would they let out such a loud scream? And also, what debunks the Bigfoot theory a little bit, depending on how you want to look at it, is that this figure was able to drive away in a white vehicle. The FBI was very quick to rule this theory out. Not even the Bigfoot theory, like the theory that whoever this was had the possibility of being connected to Dennis Dennis's case. One of the reasons they say is that it was too far away from where Dennis was last seen. It was 9 miles away from where Dennis was last seen. And the second reason being that Dennis was wearing a bright red shirt that day, and Harold never saw any sign of a bright red shirt. A lot of people though believe that the FBI was way too quick to rule this theory out, for the reason being that they think, okay, what if this was an act of foul play? What if this wasn't just nature, and what if this wasn't an animal? What if this was someone who seeked out Dennis and specifically was watching Dennis and was stalking Dennis, and they had the ability to drive a car? What if this person was just lurking nearby the Spence Field area where the Martins were at the time, saw an opportunity that Dennis was alone, and took advantage of that opportunity completely? That being said though, the people that were at Spence Field at the time never stated that they saw a man or a white vehicle there during the time that Dennis went missing. Okay, so I'm just going to mention this because I was listening to a podcast about this case, and the person who was running the podcast brought this up, and I thought it was pretty interesting, so that's why I am putting it in here. The podcast was called True Crime Garage. They did basically like an hour, 15-minute episode on this case in particular. You can find it on YouTube. And something that he said, which I hadn't read on any other articles, but it was kind of interesting, was that Harold Keyes actually had something to do with the disappearance. But what kind of knocks this theory down is the fact that he was with his son and wife when they claim to have seen this figure and when this eyewitness report happened. So that doesn't really help with this theory or with the accuracy of this theory. Basically, how the theory goes is that Harold Keyes was involved in this disappearance because he waited several days to report what he had saw. And if you follow true crime, you definitely know that there are specific cases where certain types of people will like to insert themselves in the cases and like to give certain clues and give certain opinions and kind of point police in a certain direction, whether that's really being a part of the searching process or giving hints or giving clues. A lot of people who commit these really terrible crimes sometimes like to put themselves back in it for their own gratification. So Harold saw this encounter with his family and didn't report it for days. And Dennis's case, like I said, was extremely popular. The media was all over it. They had 240 people looking for him on the second day of his disappearance. This wasn't a very quiet case. It got a lot of coverage very fast. And so a lot of people think that because he waited such a long period of time to report this, that is kind of suspicious in and of itself, as well as no one really knows where he went after this. He kind of just disappeared with his family and never was really seen or heard from again. The situation that Harold says he witnessed is literally in every single article you will read about this case. However, what happened to him and his family after this is talked about in none of them, and it's not necessarily that it should be even talked about because this isn't their case, it's Dennis's case, but that is just something to keep in mind. Several years after Dennis went missing, there was a hunter who was hunting illegally in the forest, and 3 miles away from where Dennis was last seen, he claims to have found skull remains of, in particular, a small boy, which if you think about it, there wouldn't have been any way for him to indicate whether it was a boy or a girl at the time. Didn't even report this until 16 years after Dennis went missing. So he claims to have found these remains several years after Dennis went missing and then didn't report it until 16 years after Dennis went missing. He claims he never reported this because he thought he was going to be arrested for his illegal hunting. He was hunting illegally in this national park, so he thought he was going to be arrested, and so that's why he says he never said anything. When investigators went in and tried to look for these remains, they found nothing. It is also very important to note that the people that were searching for Dennis searched 56 miles. So it's very unlikely to believe that unless he was placed there much longer after the search, that his remains were there to begin with and people just kind of looked over them. So this case ultimately went cold. There was never any evidence, there was never any clues other than the possible shoe print and the possible sighting. There was never any clues to where Dennis could have been, and the case just went completely cold after that. So remember how I said in the beginning of this video that things just get very weird? They got weird before what I'm about to tell you. This is just beyond bizarre in my opinion. Dennis was not the only one that has gone missing from the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. From what I was able to find, he was the first. However, there has been many more people who have disappeared after that. On October 8th of 1976, about 7 years after Dennis's disappearance, there was a 16-year-old high school sophomore named Trenny Lynn Gibson who was on a field trip with her school at the time. Her school had separated the kids into smaller groups based on how well their hiking skills, but after they were separated into smaller groups, Trenny disappeared without a trace. To this day, she has not been found. September 25th of 1981, 58-year-old Thelma Pauline Melton, or Polly as the people in her life called her, was on a hike with her two friends through the park. Polly was actually in front of her two friends at the time, and while they were hiking along this trail, there was a turn, and Polly turned around the corner, and when her friends turned shortly shortly after her, Polly was gone. Polly had been hiking that specific trail for 20 years. Her friends searched for her in all the places they thought to look, but could not find her anywhere. Something also to note about Polly is that she had high blood pressure as well as weight problems. She was a little overweight at the time, so her friends were walking behind her, and she was a slower walker at the time, and so it wasn't like she could have gone very far, started running off or anything like that. She vanished and has not been found since. In 2008, 51-year-old Michael Heron, who actually lived in the national park with his family, drove off to go sightseeing one afternoon, waved his family goodbye, and that was the last time he was ever seen. His truck was found not too far off in the campsite with the ignition still on, but him nowhere to be found. There was no sign of a struggle, there was no sign of a break-in, there was no sign of anything. And it doesn't end there, you guys, it's crazy. In March 2012, 24-year-old Derek Joseph checked into the Microtel Inn and Suites. This hotel was right near the national park, and his car was actually found in the parking lot of the national park. When authorities found his car, they were really surprised with what they had found. They found newly purchased survival gear in his car. I'm gonna look down here just so I get everything that they found. They found a packing axe, a compass, a lamp, a pocket knife sharpener, food. They found his wallet with a bunch of cash in it. So he had been well prepared for this trip that he was going on, but the items that he had purchased to help him if he needed it never made it out of the car. This case, however, ends a little bit differently because authorities ended up finding a note on the back of Derek's car that said, "Don't try to follow me." Even with that note, authorities searched but were unable to find any trace of Derek. On June 1st, 2015, 62-year-old Jenny Bennett, who was an avid hiker and an avid outdoorswoman, she loved being outdoors. She loved hiking through this national park. She had been through the worst trails on the national park, and by worst, I mean the most difficult, and she loved it. She loved just being outdoors and being with nature. She lived in North Carolina at the time, but like I said, this park was kind of right on the state lines of North Carolina and Tennessee, and she had been planning to move up to Vermont where her sister lived. But by the time the movers came on June 8th to help move her things, Jenny was nowhere to be found. Jenny's body was found at a trailhead in the park. Her body was found sitting upright against a rock, and she was sitting in a creek. So she was sitting in water, and the autopsy showed that she died of environmental hypothermia. This was due to the water she was sitting in. However, her tox screen also showed that she had certain pills in her system. The tox screen was pretty high, so no one was able to figure out if it was an accidental or intentional overdose, because Jenny seemed to have loved her life and she was about to move up to Vermont and was super excited about it, so no one really thought that there was any reason that she would have to want to end her life. After doing some research, I noticed that national parks actually do have a pretty high rate of suicide, but it is just kind of crazy to me that all of these people have disappeared in this national park, and how many people have disappeared in that park alone. That hike that Jenny was on was a simple hike. It was a routine hike. She had done it a bunch of times. People who know her say that the hike that she took that day was more of a boring hike for people with Jenny's type of hiking experience. So it wasn't like she went on this crazy intense hike and ended up falling or slipping or anything like that. She did have some bruises on her, but they weren't able to figure out what that was caused by, but they were able to conclude that those weren't the cause of her death. That is really all the information I have for you guys on Dennis's disappearance. There are a couple theories in this case. The first theory is that Dennis just got lost in the forest and ended up wandering off to a place where he shouldn't have and either ended up drowning in the lake. Maybe he slipped in the mud and fell, hit his head on a rock, and just was never found. Another theory that's very possible is that Dennis was attacked by an animal. The only thing that I question in this theory is that if he was attacked by an animal, wouldn't there be a sound? Like, wouldn't have someone heard it, especially if he was so close to where his family was at the time? I feel like someone would have definitely heard something. The next theory is that this was an abduction. Someone was either stalking Dennis and his family. It was either the man that Harold Keyes had saw or something along those lines, considering he left without a trace of evidence and has never been found to this day. But with that all being said, I am so curious to know what you guys think happened in this case, so leave all of your theories in the comments box below. If there's anything I left out that you want to add, definitely leave it in the comments below as well, so we're all equally informed. And that is the end of this video. Alright, you guys, I hope you enjoyed another true crime video. If you're new to my channel, hi, my name's Savannah. I make videos 3 days a week, Sunday, Tuesday, Thursday. You should subscribe, join the family. I love you guys so much, and I will be back in a couple days with a brand new video. Bye, guys.